The secret US program that watched every Soviet move from space. Imagine you are a Soviet general. It is 1960. You are standing in a secure military installation deep inside Russian territory. No American aircraft could possibly reach you. No foreign spy could see you. You are completely hidden from the world. Or so you think. At that very moment, thousands of miles above your head, a small American satellite is silently drifting through the darkness of space. Its camera is pointed directly at the Earth below. At you. At your missiles. At your secrets. And you have absolutely no idea. This is the story of Corona, the most classified intelligence program in American history. A program so secret, its existence was denied for over 30 years. A program that gave the United States eyes above the Iron Curtain at the height of the Cold War. Stay with me, because what you are about to hear is one of the most extraordinary stories ever told. To understand why Corona was born, we need to go back to the early 1950s. The Cold War was not just a political rivalry between two superpowers. It was a terrifying chess match where neither side could see the other player's pieces. The Soviet Union was vast, enormous. It stretched across 11 time zones and nearly 9 million square miles. Inside that immensity, the Soviets were building things: missiles, bombers, nuclear warheads, entire secret cities that did not appear on any map. American leaders were desperate for information. How many missiles did the Soviets actually have? Where were their air bases? Were they preparing to strike? Without answers, every decision, every military budget, every diplomatic move, every treaty negotiation was made half-blind. And in the nuclear age, being blind was not just dangerous, it was potentially catastrophic. The CIA and the US Air Force tried everything. They recruited spies. They intercepted radio signals. They sent U-2 reconnaissance planes deep into Soviet airspace at altitudes where they believed no missile could reach them. For a few years, the U-2 worked brilliantly. Pilots flew over Moscow, over Siberia, over Soviet nuclear test sites, photographing everything below. The images were stunning. Analysts could identify individual aircraft on runways from 70,000 feet. But then came the 1st of May, 1960, a date that changed everything. A Soviet surface-to-air missile brought down a U-2 piloted by Francis Gary Powers over central Russia. Powers survived. He was captured. And suddenly, the most sensitive intelligence program America had was exposed in front of the entire world. President Eisenhower was humiliated. Soviet Premier Nikita Khrushchev exploded with outrage. A crucial diplomatic summit collapsed, and the U-2 program over Soviet territory was finished. America needed a new way to see, a way that could never be shot down, a way that could never be captured, a way the Soviets could not stop. The answer had been quietly taking shape for years, in a top-secret program that operated out of a small corner of the CIA, so compartmentalized that most of the government did not even know it existed. They called it Corona. The origins of Corona trace back to 1956 and 1957, when a small group of visionaries inside the CIA, the Air Force, and the private defense contractor Lockheed proposed something that sounded more like science fiction than military intelligence. What if you could put a camera in orbit around the Earth? What if, instead of risking a pilot's life every time you needed to photograph a Soviet missile base, you could simply launch a satellite and have it photograph the entire country on a continuous loop? The idea was breathtaking in its ambition. Space technology in the late 1950s was primitive. Nobody had successfully put a camera in orbit.
Nobody had figured out how to get the photographs back down to Earth. Nobody even knew if cameras could survive the radiation and extreme temperatures of space. But the need was so urgent and the potential so enormous that President Eisenhower gave the project his personal approval. Work began immediately, in total secrecy. To hide what they were doing, the program was given a cover story. Publicly, the launches were described as part of a scientific research program called Discoverer, studying cosmic rays and biological effects of spaceflight. Some launches even carried small animals, mice and monkeys, to make the cover story more convincing. Behind the cover story, teams of engineers worked around the clock to solve problem after problem. The cameras had to be small enough to fit inside a satellite. They had to operate in the vacuum of space. The film, because in the late 1950s digital photography did not exist, had to be exposed, collected, and somehow returned to Earth intact.
That last part was perhaps the most audacious element of the entire program. The plan was this. After the satellite finished its photographic pass over the Soviet Union, it would eject a small capsule containing the exposed film. That capsule would re-enter the Earth's atmosphere, slow itself with a parachute, and then, here is where it gets truly extraordinary, an Air Force aircraft would fly through the sky and snag the descending capsule with a hook before it could fall into the ocean. If you think that sounds impossible, you are not alone. The engineers thought so too at first. The program suffered failure after failure. The first 13 missions either exploded on launch, failed to reach orbit, or lost their film capsules to the ocean. 18 months of effort produced nothing. But on August 18, 1960, just weeks after the U-2 was shot down, Corona Mission 9009 changed history. The satellite, designated KH-1, launched successfully from Vandenberg Air Force Base in California. It climbed into orbit. It began its photographic pass over Soviet territory. And then, for the first time in history, everything went right. The film capsule separated cleanly. It re-entered the atmosphere. The parachute deployed, and a specially modified Air Force JC-119 aircraft flying over the Pacific Ocean near Hawaii caught the capsule mid-air on the very first attempt. When analysts at the CIA developed the film, they were stunned. In a single mission, Corona had photographed more Soviet territory than all previous U-2 flights combined. More than 1.6 million square miles of the Soviet Union, in astonishing detail. They could see airfields, they could count aircraft, they could identify missile launch sites and estimate the number of operational weapons. They could see rail lines, military depots, naval bases, and fortifications stretching across thousands of miles. One CIA official later said that the single Corona film canister contained more intelligence about the Soviet military than had been collected in the entire previous decade. And perhaps most importantly, what they saw, or rather, what they did not see, was almost as valuable as the images themselves. For years, American military planners had been deeply alarmed by what they called the missile gap, a fear that the Soviets had built a massive, overwhelming advantage in intercontinental ballistic missiles that could destroy American cities before any response was possible. The Corona photographs told a different story. The Soviets had missiles, certainly, but the terrifying numbers that had haunted American nightmares, hundreds, perhaps thousands of ICBMs aimed at American cities, simply were not there. The missile gap, it turned out, was largely a myth. The Soviets were powerful, but they were not poised for an imminent, overwhelming strike. This was not just intelligence. This was sanity-restoring information in a world that had been threatening to spiral toward catastrophic miscalculation. Corona had not just gathered photographs, it had potentially pulled the world back from the edge of nuclear war. So how exactly did Corona work? Let us walk through it. The satellites were launched on Thor-Agena rockets from Vandenberg Air Force Base on the California coast. The Agena upper stage was both the propulsion system and the camera platform. Once in orbit, at altitudes typically between 100 and 180 miles, the satellite would begin its pass over the Soviet Union. At those altitudes, the satellite completed an orbit of the Earth roughly every 90 minutes, meaning it passed over different parts of the Soviet territory on each orbit, due to the Earth rotating beneath it. The camera system on early Corona satellites was called the KH-1, with KH standing for keyhole, a fitting name for a program designed to peer through the locked doors of the Soviet state. Over time, the cameras evolved through multiple generations, KH-1 through KH-4, with each version offering dramatically improved resolution and coverage. The cameras used a rotating lens system to scan back and forth across a wide swath of ground below. Film, the same basic technology as a movie camera, just adapted for space, captured everything in the camera's field of view. When the film supply was exhausted, or when the mission was complete, the satellite ejected a film return capsule called a bucket. The bucket was a small, cone-shaped re-entry vehicle protected by a heat shield to survive the fiery plunge back through the atmosphere. Once slowed to subsonic speed, a parachute deployed. And then came the mid-air recovery, one of the most spectacular pieces of Cold War tradecraft ever devised. Air Force JC-130 Hercules aircraft, specially modified with a long trailing hook mechanism, would fly into the recovery zone above the Pacific Ocean.
The crew would visually acquire the descending parachute and maneuver to intercept it. When the hook caught the parachute lines, the capsule was reeled into the aircraft like a fish on a line. If the aircraft missed, and sometimes they did, the capsule was designed to float for a limited time before its seawater-activated self-destruct mechanism sent it to the ocean floor. The Soviets could never be allowed to recover Corona film. The entire process from launch to recovered film typically took 2 to 3 days. By the mid-1960s, the system had become remarkably reliable, launching dozens of successful missions per year. Corona did not stand still. From 1960 to 1972, when the program was officially terminated, it launched 145 missions. 102 of those returned usable film. The technology improved with each generation. Early KH-1 cameras could resolve objects roughly 40 feet across on the ground, enough to identify a large building or a missile launcher. By the time of the KH-4B satellites in the late 1960s, resolution had improved to roughly 6 feet, enough to identify individual vehicles, count aircraft parked on runways, or distinguish between different types of missile systems.
The coverage was staggering. Over 12 years, Corona photographed essentially all of the Soviet Union, China, the Middle East, and other areas of strategic interest. Analysts could track changes at Soviet facilities over time, watching new construction appear, identifying new weapons systems, monitoring movements of military units. The intelligence product was transformative. American military and political leaders could now make decisions based on something approaching real knowledge of Soviet capabilities, rather than estimates, guesses, and worst-case fears. Treaty negotiations, previously hampered by mutual suspicion and the impossibility of verification, became more productive. When the United States and Soviet Union eventually negotiated arms control agreements, Corona-derived intelligence gave American negotiators confidence that they could verify whether the Soviets were complying. Satellites became, in the language of arms control, national technical means of verification, a polite way of saying that spy satellites were now an accepted tool of international diplomacy. But the program also carried extraordinary risks and extraordinary secrets that went far beyond simply pointing cameras at the ground. One of the most remarkable aspects of Corona was how successfully it was kept secret, not just from the Soviets, but from almost everyone in the United States government as well. Access to Corona intelligence was controlled under one of the most restrictive classification systems ever created. Analysts who worked with the images could not tell their families what they did. They could not discuss their work with colleagues who lacked specific clearances. The program's existence was compartmentalized so tightly that members of Congress who sat on intelligence committees were not automatically cleared to know about it. The Soviets, of course, eventually realized that American reconnaissance satellites were passing over their territory. They could track the orbital paths. They could see the launches. But there was essentially nothing they could do about it. Unlike aircraft, satellites in orbit could not be shot down by existing Soviet weapons in the early 1960s. And under the emerging norms of international law, a nation's sovereignty did not extend into space, a principle the United States had been careful to establish, in part so that programs like Corona would have legal cover. There was also the matter of what Corona sometimes saw that nobody expected. Analysts poring over film from Soviet territory occasionally discovered things that had never appeared in any intelligence estimate. Secret cities, facilities of unknown purpose, military installations in locations where, according to every source previously available, nothing should exist. In one celebrated case, Corona imagery revealed a massive Soviet radar installation that appeared to be designed for tracking incoming ballistic missiles, evidence that the Soviets were developing a national missile defense system that American planners had not anticipated. The images also became a kind of historical record. Because Corona photographed the same areas repeatedly over years and decades, analysts could watch history unfold in satellite imagery. They could see Soviet agriculture collectivization. They could see industrial construction. They could watch the physical transformation of a nation across 12 years of continuous observation. Corona was not just gathering military intelligence. In some profound sense, it was watching the Soviet Union live.
By the early 1970s, Corona had reached the limits of what its basic design could achieve. Newer, more capable reconnaissance satellite programs
codenamed Hexagon and Gambit, were ready to take over. These systems offered dramatically higher resolution, larger film capacity, and more sophisticated operations. Corona flew its last mission in May 1972. The program was officially terminated, its files locked away in secure vaults, its personnel sworn to continued silence. For more than 2 decades, Corona did not officially exist. Then, in 1995, President Bill Clinton signed an executive order declassifying the Corona Imagery Archive. 800,000 photographs covering the period from 1960 to 1972 were released to the public. Historians, geographers, archaeologists, and environmental scientists suddenly had access to an extraordinary visual record of the Earth's surface at a specific moment in history. Archaeologists used the images to find ancient sites in the Middle East that had since been buried or destroyed. Environmental scientists used them to document changes in glaciers, rivers, and coastlines over decades. Historians used them to understand the Cold War in ways that had previously been impossible. The intelligence community also acknowledged what Corona had meant for national security. Former CIA directors described it as one of the most important intelligence programs in American history. Some argued that Corona, more than any other single program, had prevented the Cold War from becoming a hot one, by replacing the terrifying unknown with something manageable: knowledge. There is something almost poetic about the story of Corona. At the most dangerous moment in modern history, when 2 superpowers armed with enough nuclear weapons to end civilization were circling each other in mutual suspicion and fear, a small group of engineers, pilots, analysts, and spies devised a way to see the truth. Not perfect truth, not complete truth, but enough truth to keep decisions grounded in reality rather than nightmare. The Soviet general standing at his secret installation was right to feel powerful. His country was formidable. His missiles were real. But he was wrong to think he was invisible, because high above him, in the cold silence of space, America's eyes were open. And sometimes, in the most dangerous games humans play, simply being able to see clearly is the difference between catastrophe and survival. That is the legacy of Corona. Not just the photographs, not just the intelligence, but the quiet, extraordinary, world-saving power of knowing. If you found this story as remarkable as I do, leave a comment below. Tell me which part of Cold War history you want to explore next. And if you are new here, welcome. There are many more stories like this one waiting for you. Thank you for watching.